Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're continuing on in the fashion that we've done the last several videos, where I'm answering my most prominent, most common subscriber questions so that I can get you guys the information that you really want. Next question goes something like this. I run into elk off the trails and roads all the time. Why do you always preach trying to go deeper, trying to get away from the trails? Well, I'll tell you, in my 34 years of elk hunting experience, I think that there are two ends of the spectrum here in terms of what we're talking about. Those elk that are near the trails and roads that are used to people, they're absolutely there, 100%. You go up on our mountain, it's covered in roads and trails, and there are elk absolutely everywhere. That's one kind of elk. Right? And you got the elk at the other end of the spectrum who aren't pressured. And I can tell you that it's almost like they're two different creatures. If you've ever hunted elk that are extremely pressured, you understand what I'm talking about. They act like pressured elk. And hunting pressured elk is a completely different ballgame than hunting unpressured elk, who act like unpressured elk. Now, don't believe me? I'm going to run you through 21 of the ways that elk behavior changes with pressure, and then I'll let you think about that and decide for yourself whether you would rather hunt those elk that are right next to the road. We're talking especially bow hunting, right? Where elk behavior and patterning is so important. Whether you would rather hunt that elk or you would rather go into the nasty pocket away from pressure, where those elk have escaped, where they've learned over years and evolved, and they're unpressured, and they're in a habit and routine and pattern, and they act more like unpressured elk. They're more vocal. We'll get into those kinds of things here in a minute. So let's get into it. 21 of the ways that pressure changes elk behavior. And let's just get this first one out of the way, because we all understand that pressured elk become less vocal. They might only talk at night. They might only talk a little bit in the morning, or they might bugle once and then go quiet. And even if you do get them to respond, a lot of times it'll be one bugle and they shut up. But oftentimes, a lot of us deal with pressured elk who are not vocal, and that changes the game when we're bow hunting and we use and rely on calling as one of our most primary and effective tools. So those pressured elk can absolutely become harder to hunt versus unpressured elk who might be talking and just doing their elk thing throughout the day. Those elk are easier to call, they're easier to talk to, they're easier to get to engage in a conversation. Those elk are a lot of fun to hunt. It's a lot tougher to hunt those pressured quiet bulls. The second way pressure changes elk behavior is by pushing them into more secure pockets, right? They always prioritize security, but they can get into places where it just ends up being really hard to try to approach them, and they're just tucked away in places that are not only hard to find, not only places that we don't want to go, but places that they don't have to come out of a lot of times, where they can meet all of their needs all in one pocket. So let's say you're relying on glassing and you've got pressured elk that are in some secure pockets, but they have feed and they have water nearby. Those elk don't have to expose themselves a lot. So that becomes very difficult. Let's say they're in that security pocket and your goal is to call them. Now you can't glass them. They don't have to leave very often, and they're quiet. Those elk are tough to find and they're tough to play with. So those elk are the elk that have found those nasty, deep, dark holes, right? That we don't want to go into. And even if you do go into, a lot of times we have a hard time approaching because of deadfall, because of steep, cliffy areas nearby. Those are elk sanctuaries, but they make it really hard to play with those bulls. Third way pressure can change elk behavior is a lot of times elk can be scattered over a lot of country, and pressure can absolutely condense them into smaller areas, which can make them harder to find to begin with, harder to locate. And then once they're condensed, that condensing can also change their behavior, not just because of pressure, but because of the way that they interact with each other. And so once they're in those compressed areas, they just tend to act a little bit differently. They're on heightened security, they're on heightened alert. They are aware that they were pushed into those smaller areas for a reason. And so their behavior tends to change because of that, and it makes them harder to play with. The fourth way that pressure can change elk behavior is that it can reduce their daylight movement. So they're going to do more of their feeding, more of their traveling during the nighttime. And that obviously reduces our ability to glass them. It reduces our ability to get into transition zones and really messes with our tactics, especially during that morning part of the day. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post-Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory. It's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Now, the fifth way that pressure changes elk behavior is very closely related to that, is that it forces them to get into their beds earlier a lot of times. So it reduces their daylight movement because they tend to transition earlier. So they're in their bedding areas earlier. And that makes that transition play, it eliminates the transition play a lot of times. If they're transitioning in the dark towards the bed, we don't have that option that you hear me talk so much about, being able to intercept them between the feed and the bed in the morning. And those bedded elk, they're just like midday elk, then they become a lot tougher to hunt, especially if they're not being vocal. Then what are you going to do? You're going to still hunt through that area, and still hunting elk is the most challenging way to hunt them when they're bedded and they're just fully alert, eyes, nose, ears of a lot of different animals, a lot of times grouped up, all watching, smelling, and listening for danger. The sixth way that pressure changes elk behavior is the opposite end of the day. So they will leave their security and their bedding later than they normally would. So if an unpressured elk might head out and start feeding and working their way down towards their main feeding area at 4 p.m., let's say, and they're up on their feet, which gives you a lot more opportunity, especially if you can get in that evening transition zone ahead of them. A pressured elk might not get up from the bed until 30 minutes before dark, maybe even a little bit closer to dark, and then wait and stage to even enter any kind of opening until right at dark. And so that makes them almost impossible to hunt during that last period of the day. Seventh way that pressure changes elk behavior is through their travel route behavior. So pressured elk a lot of times are going to stop using the easy stuff, the places that we love to try to intercept them or find them. So they're going to avoid easy trails or visually easy trails or saddles or creek bottoms or any kind of opening that makes it easier for hunters to spot or intercept them. So it changes their travel behavior and makes those pressured elk harder to hunt. Closely related to that, and the eighth way that pressure changes elk behavior is it changes their use of terrain, not just the micro features like trails and saddles, but the broader terrain. terrain. They're going to be out in the open less. They're not going to be on those open faces that we love to glass. So it changes that actual terrain behavior as well. They're going to use that security cover a whole lot more. They're going to stay under the security of canopy cover and vegetation. They're going to use edges a whole lot more than the open stuff. And this gets to be important where when you tell me, Matt, I don't have a choice, I have to hunt pressured elk. Okay, so this is then how we start to think about that, knowing that they're going to use edges and they're going to use more cover. How do we position ourselves accordingly? Which leads us to the 9th way that pressure changes elk behavior. They just start using more secure cover in nasty places. So that means that they're going to start using the steeper country. They're going to start using deadfall more. They're going to start using the deeper drainages and the cliffed out areas where they can get in and out of, but it makes it very difficult for humans to do, especially undetected. So why does this matter? Because we've touched on the security piece before. Well, elk are opportunistic in a lot of ways, right? They want to take the easiest route possible. They don't want to be trying to walk through the nasty stuff, especially bulls like with big antlers, right? Walking around, they want to go feed and hang out where it's the most convenient and where it's the easiest for them. But that pressure can push them into those nasty deadfall pockets, for instance, that are really hard for hunters to try to hunt and get in and out of quietly. It's exhausting climbing over all that stuff all day long, trying to get set up in those areas, trying to find windows. Where are you even going to call to these elk? It just makes it really challenging when they get into that thick stuff that's almost impossible for us to try to maneuver quietly, stealthily, or make a setup. So the 10th way that pressure changes elk behavior is that elk become more sensitive to calling in those pressured areas near the trails and roads. They just hear a lot more human calling. So they become sensitive to it, especially if they've been busted once. They learn fast. So you get more educated elk, I believe, near the trails and the roads. And that just changes their behavior and response. A lot of times they don't want to respond to it at all, especially vocally. And if they do, they're coming in quiet, they're circling, they tend to hang up more, they tend to really use their visual acuity to search areas from further out. So you get more bulls hung up at 70, 80, 90 yards where they're trying to look in there to see if they can actually see a cow that's talking to them or a bull talking to them. And so that call sensitivity becomes a huge factor in how we hunt them. The 11th way that calling could change elk behavior is that they may be less willing to travel long distances, both in search of other elk, whether that's cows or just groups, or in their sensitivity to calling, and you may have to get in there even closer to them. They're not going to be willing to cross a drainage to come over and check something out. So you're going to have to really use our bubble rules when we're thinking about talking to elk that are less willing to travel. The 12th way that pressure can change elk behavior is oftentimes it makes them come in silently. They're just going to be more quiet. So it won't be that they don't respond to calls. It's just going to be that they'll do it quietly. And we've seen this over and over and over again in our local country here where those elk have been called to, they've been pressured a whole bunch. Their response is not to talk back to you. Their response is to go check it out. They don't want to pass up the opportunity to find a cow, but they're going to do it quietly on their terms. They're going to get sneaky and they're going to use distance to try to check out visually. They're going to circle and use their nose. They're going to be listening acutely for any kind of sound that doesn't add up to what they're expecting. And so those bulls can be a little bit more challenging when they're coming in quiet. How long do you stay at a stand? Do you just call to locate and then move on? Well, in high pressured areas, you might need to set up for 30, 40 minutes and use your cow calling in order to give those pressured bulls time to actually respond. The 13th way that pressure can change elk behaviors, they can become extremely cautious to any kind of calling. Whether you're a world champion elk caller or not, I think that when they hear any kind of sound that is supposed to represent an elk, they become a lot more cautious, just like we talked about in that last scenario with them not wanting to move long distances. And so when we're calling, we've got to really pay attention to realism. How far away are we from those elk when we're actually trying to talk to them? Are we adding context? Does the context make sense to that elk with the established scenario, with the scene, with the time of the season that we're talking about? Are we just trying to bugle aggressively to those bulls? Is it the first half of the month? That might not make sense. And so with pressured elk, I think that the calling strategy and understanding what they're saying and what they actually want and the context of the herd, I think that that matters even more with pressured elk. The 14th way that pressure changes elk behavior is in their use of wind. I feel like elk that I've experienced that are in unpressured areas still use wind, absolutely, but they aren't quite as cautious. So a bull that I've seen responding to sound that is unpressured tends not to circle quite as much. He tends to come right in. He trusts what he hears more, and he just trusts the setup a little bit more than that pressured bull. That pressured bull tends to really rely on the wind. And elk in general, pressured versus unpressured, I believe those pressured elk tend to set up where they can use that wind to their advantage a whole lot more. So those tend to be the elk that are using that top third of the slope to their advantage. That's where they tend to bed a little bit more. You know, when you get your unpressured elk, I think that they tend to bed just wherever gives them enough cover and might be even closer to their feed and water. But those pressured elk, they're picking very specific cautious spots, probably a little further away from the feed, a little bit further away from the water. They want to protect their bedding area. They don't want to just spend a whole bunch of time in a feeding area and then have a predator be easily able to track them and follow them to their bed. So I think they're a whole lot more cautious about how they use the wind. The 15th way that pressure changes elk behavior is in how they bed to be able to detect danger. I think that they tend to bed in places where they have better visual and get to pair that visual with scent. You know, so if they're on, say, the top third of a slope, a lot of times they'll bed with their back to the top of that slope where they've got wind coming over the top. And then from mid-morning throughout a lot of the day, they've got rising thermals up into their nose. And then they might have some different prevailing wind. A lot of times they're catching multiple wind directions when they're bedded at the top. And if they can combine that with really good visuals, and a lot of times those higher positions give them a better hearing advantage as well. That makes it really tough, especially if they're in spots that make it harder for humans to try to sneak into as well, you know, because of the terrain or because of the deadfall, because of the vegetation. So bedding in tougher positions for hunters is a primary way that elk adapt to pressure. The 16th way that pressure changes elk behavior is they become a lot less willing to use open country, whether that's open slopes, whether that's parks and meadows. They just know that vegetation and terrain are their best friends a lot of times from being spotted. They know that after years of this, these elk, you know, that you're hunting, a lot of those cows and bulls have lived more than decades, some of them more than 15 years. And so they've come to understand that a lot of times when they're out in the open, that's when danger comes and finds them. So it's not a big leap of the imagination to understand that they then tend to use those secure pockets where either the terrain or the canopy and vegetation breaks them up, hides them, conceals them from hunters. The 17th way that pressure changes elk behavior is in where they feed. So instead of using big openings, they're going to find those more secure pockets of feed near their bedding areas where they don't have to travel as far, or in the timber. There's a lot of feed in the timber, especially if it's timber that breaks up our visual advantage to be able to glass them, but still allows sunlight in. Some of those places up in the hills can be just covered in great food, and those elk really never have to step out into the opening. And those pressured elk tend to use those a whole lot more, and using parks and meadows and open hillsides a whole lot less. The 18th way that pressure changes elk behavior is in the distance that they're willing to cover between security and feed. I think that a lot of times that really gets condensed down. In fact, to the point where a lot of times I believe that they can go bed and they can feed in the same place. if they're in a very secure pocket. Now, the less secure they feel about it, the more they're going to travel. And I think that's a protection mechanism so that, again, a predator can't easily just follow them into their bed and kill them. And so if the area is really secure and they feel good about it, they've got strong wind, they can see well, they can hear well, it's really noisy for a predator to try to get in there. Maybe there's some steep side hills, lots of deadfall, it's crunchy, it's loud, there's shale around. Those types of areas, I think, condense them down to where they will stand up, they can feed, they can go lay down 100 yards away or less, and they feel very secure in not having to travel great distances between the feed and security. The 19th way that pressure changes elk behavior is in their use of water. It's going to push them to be nocturnal in a lot of cases, and elk get a lot of their water from their good food, especially when there's a little bit of moisture around in that feed or they've moved to those types of areas for feed. They get a lot of moisture from it, and so they don't necessarily have to travel to water a whole lot or as much as we would like them to. And when they do, I think that they start doing it a whole lot more at night. That was my experience early on, especially before I stopped paying so much attention to the water and recognized that, all right, maybe they're using it, but they're using it at night. It's not going to do me any good to sit there. I would check it, first thing in the morning, and it would have gotten hammered at night. And then I would sit there all day long and there'd be no elk showing up. Not to say that in some places that water can't be a very valuable tool, but if there's a decent amount of water around, I wouldn't expect to use it in high pressured areas as a reliable source of elk traffic, because a lot of times they're going to do it at night, or they're going to find those watering areas that are in very secure areas that they feel safe in if they're going to hit it during daylight at all. The 20th way that pressure can change elk behavior is in elevation. I don't particularly pay much attention to elevation. I don't think that elk are going to be at a certain elevation at a certain time of year. I think that it's 100% pressure related. In fact, we hunt one particular area where on the private ranches down low, it'll be loaded with elk. There'll be hundreds, if not thousands of elk down in the river bottom. And then if you cross the highway, you might have to go up to 12,000 feet on the other side of the road to be able to get into elk that feel a little bit less pressured up in there. They found secure pockets. They found that elevation protected them, and they just decided to deal with the food quality and the water quality that it's up high because pressure pushed them up there. The unpressured elk that were living on the ranches, they had everything that they needed down there. So it's not necessarily an elevation issue, it's a pressure issue, and pressure can absolutely change the elevation that those elk use if they can find security. And the 21st way that pressure can change elk behavior is that they will oftentimes exploit private property boundaries, whether that's moving completely onto the private or using private to feed a lot of times and then coming back on to public, or the reverse is often true as well, where they might come out into better feed on, say, national forest and then go back onto private during the daylight hours, which makes it the toughest to hunt. So in those particular situations, we're going to have to try to use those fence lines and figure out the timing to that if you're hunting near those private boundaries. And that can be a good indicator of where those elk may have gotten pushed. And if you can find those travel corridors back and forth, if they're using both sides of that, that could be an advantage for you. But it's absolutely something that we all recognize happens in a lot of places. I don't like to hunt those places. I avoid those private areas. But if that's what you're stuck with, we understand that that's happening, and that's how you're going to have to change your tactic with those elk. So there you have it. 21 ways that pressure can change elk behavior. Didn't want to dive into a whole lot of them, even though any one of those 21 ways that pressure changes elk behavior could be a video all in itself. I just wanted to highlight for you that that's how much we're facing with those pressured elk. So elk near trails and roads, absolutely. That happens. They live right off of it. They've adapted to that pressure, but they become a different type of elk to hunt than elk that are unpressured. So for me personally, I'm willing to pay the price of suffering through some steep, nasty terrain. Maybe it's covering more miles to get into country where those elk act more like unpressured elk. Those are the elk that I love to hunt. The other elk near the pressure, those are a lot more frustrating. Some years, I'm still forced to deal with those pressured elk, and it's a lot tougher to hunt those elk than it is when I can get back and away and hunt those unpressured animals. So just wanted to highlight that, and that's why I talk about hunting the security. That's why I talk about getting back in and away from people, not just distance-wise, but paying the price to suffer and find those pockets that are protected by something that's a higher barrier of entry that a lot of folks aren't willing to pay the price. They don't want to pay that high cost of getting into that country to hunt elk or trying to get that elk back out through a miserable pack out. For me, I think it's a lot more fun to hunt those elk, so I'm willing to pay the price, train hard all year for it. That's what I want to do. That's what I live for. That decision is up to you. I just want to give you the answers to my most commonly asked questions and try to let you wrestle with that yourself. Now, if any of this made you realize that you need a better plan going into season, I've got several ways that I love to help folks based on my 34 years of hunting Western big game and guiding Western big game and my 30 years as a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach. And those primary ways are through a hunt audit. You can reach out to me, sign up for a hunt audit. I will send you a questionnaire that you fill out in detail, and then I will provide you with a 30-plus page report on your hunt area, on your plan, and then we schedule a video call to sit down, look at your maps together. I answer any other questions that you have so you feel more prepared going into season. You can join me on Team Backbone, where you get access to me. It's about the only way that I allow access to me other than through a hunt audit or one of my training plans. So if you want daily access to me, you can join me on Team Backbone and join our community of other elk, mule deer, bear, Western hunters, and get feedback from all of us and just participate in that community. You can grab my ebooks if you'd like to boost your foundational knowledge of elk behavior, all these pressure topics that we talked about today through those ebooks, or you can sign up for one of my training or nutrition plans and put my 30 years of professional experience to use for you there, whether that's, leading up season with a training or nutrition plan or an in-season nutrition plan. I'm happy to help you out in any of those ways, and you can check that out at backboneunlimited.com. Sure appreciate you guys being here. If you have questions that you'd like me to address, please hit me up in the comments. I read and respond to all of them. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.